their helicopter crashed. They had to adjust their plan. They had a bunch of breaching problems to get into where they suspected bin Laden was. So really, ultimately, the plan just changed immediately. And it was all about adjustments and just dealing with the unknown.
Rich Diviney, a best-selling author, leadership and human performance expert, and retired Navy SEAL commander.
Growth happens just outside our comfort zone. We are designed to step outside of our comfort zone. It's exactly what has caused our species to go from cave dweller to space explorer. Moving horizons is quite literally creating the duration pathway outcome by picking something to focus on. Sometimes the horizon is survive this next 5 minutes. Leadership is a choice. And I'm not saying it's a choice by the leader, it's a choice by the follower. 17 years later, I run into two guys, and both of them at that moment said, "Sir, we would trust you anytime, anywhere. We would follow you anytime, anywhere." That's very powerful.
Hey, Rich, how are you?
Good, Peter. How are you? It's good to see you again, my friend.
Welcome back. The last time we spoke, we were focusing very much on your book, The Attributes, but this time we're here to talk about your new book. Yeah, let's maybe start with what inspired you to write the book and like the evolution of your thinking.
Yeah, it's funny because the mastery of uncertainty concept is something that I have always been wanting to write about. And in fact, the attributes was always just a piece of that. I realized as I began to go down the author and the writing book path that the attributes piece of it was a huge piece. And I needed to actually just chunk out that section and write about that. So I almost laid some groundwork to what I ultimately felt like the whole arc concept was mastering uncertainty. And so in a I guess, unconscious genius that I wrote the attributes first, able to build the business and build an assessment tool and got this foundational element so that once I was able to put together Master of Uncertainty, attributes is a piece of it, but it's a big piece. And so now when people go through the Master of Uncertainty book, they'll realize when they get the attributes piece, oh, actually, there are resources I can then look into for the attributes. But ultimately, I have always been fascinated with, and especially as a SEAL, what it was that allowed us to do what we did, because I never described the SEALs in terms of our shooting or skydiving or scuba diving. I said we were individuals and teams that could drop into chaos and complexity and perform. We were masters of uncertainty. That was what we were. That was our job title. And so I always was like, okay, how do we do this? Because I felt if I could articulate that, then that's something I could then tell others, and found that it's not a SEAL thing, it's a human thing. And once you can describe it and put it together, you can repeat it and you can practice it. So that was the impetus and why I'm so excited to get this concept out finally.
The book opens with a story of the bin Laden raid. In that regard, how did that mission encapsulate the essence of Masters of Uncertainty?
First of all, it's one of the most well-known missions. So I want to pick something that almost everybody had a sense of, rather than try to explain an operation that no one knows anything about. It was honestly famous and exciting, but really very indicative of this idea that even though the guys had not that much time to prepare, they still did a huge amount of preparation. They built mock-ups, they did drill after drill, they rehearsed the heck out of this thing before they ever left the country. And so they knew step by step exactly what they were supposed to do when they hit the target. And inevitably, because Murphy's Law is always with us, things didn't go as planned. No plan survives first contact with the enemy is the way, or Mike Tyson's famous quote, everybody has a plan until you get punched in the face, right? So everybody knows that as soon as they got there, a helicopter crashed. So they had to adjust their plan. They couldn't go from the top down. They had a bunch of breaching problems to get into the building and then up to where they suspected bin Laden was. So really, ultimately, the plan just changed immediately. And it was all about adjustments and tweaking and just dealing with the unknown that kept on hitting them. And of course, the finale is etched in history, right? The guys were able to eliminate bin Laden as well as get back with really no injuries at all. And that's phenomenal in terms of the scope and the seriousness of that operation. So it's a great way to open it up in terms of also say that, hey, these ideas, these things that the guys used, all Navy SEALs used to master uncertainty aren't Navy SEAL things. They're human things. And so the intro is meant to let people know that this is something that's accessible by everybody. There's always a saying that growth happens just outside our comfort zone. As humans, we grow when we step outside the comfort zone and experience things that we've never experienced before or aren't comfortable at all. That act in of itself is a step into uncertainty. And so there's of course uncertainty that happens to us that we just have to deal with and move through. And sometimes that's good, sometimes that's fairly traumatic. But then there's this very deliberate act that humans are are really famous for. The Homo sapiens are famous for exploration and discovery. And this idea that we are designed to step outside of our comfort zone. In fact, we get rewarded by stepping outside our comfort zone neurologically through dopamine. But it's exactly what has caused our species to go from cave dweller to space explorer. And I think that's a fascinating thing to tap into, because I think when we start thinking about the beauty of the unknown, it's a call to action to grow as humans, to explore, to discover, to create, to evolve. And that's exciting to me.
In the book, you also talk about something called the predictability paradigm.
Yeah, we as humans have also designed our lives to be as certain as possible. As much as uncertainty causes growth and expansion, our brains typically don't like it. We like to try to make certain our environments. It's why we're always searching for explanation. The predictability paradigm just is a nod to this idea that, especially in today's society, we have designed and we continue to design our lives with as much predictability and expectation as possible. Whether it's the apps on our phone that give us instantaneous information, or you name the service that allows for us to understand or predict what's going to go on, we walk around in life with a general attitude that we know what's going to happen. Now, that's not, of course, a bad thing, but if we fall into that too complacently, then we get hit really hard when what we don't expect does happen. So we have to be careful of that.
The DPO framework, like how does these elements help you navigate uncertainty?
Yeah, so the DPO really is an explanation of uncertainty neurologically. What's happening when uncertainty strikes is our brains are searching for those three factors in the environment. In other words, our brains are constantly trying to define an environment or situation through those three factors. A, duration, how long will this last? Pathway is the route, in or out or through. And then outcome, what happens at the end of this? If we are in absence of one or more of those factors, we find ourselves in uncertainty from mild to extreme. An example would be, there's an illness. So say one of us gets strep throat. Okay, strep throat is an illness that has a known cure, right? There's antibiotics you can take for strep throat. People have gotten strep throat and survived for the most part. Everybody survives that. So in the case of strep throat, you're absent only duration. You're not sure exactly how long it's going to take for you to get better, but you have a pathway, which is the antibiotics, and you have an outcome, you'll get better. So your uncertainty level is basically mild. But now say we get something like the flu, which is more a virus, right? And there's no real known, and you can't take something necessarily for the flu. The recommendation is just get some rest, drink warm water, drink tea, whatever that is. But there's no real known thing you can do. So now we're in absence of two, right? We're in absence of, but at the same time, most people survive the flu, right? So we know outcome, that's a known, but we're in absence of duration and we're in absence of pathway. Okay? So our uncertainty level is more moderate. But say now there's a virus that shows up, and this is going to sound awfully familiar for all of us, but there's a virus that shows up that we haven't seen before. There's no known cure or vaccine, and people are dying from it. Okay, now we're in a situation where duration is unknown, pathway is unknown, and outcome is unknown. This is when we fall into deep uncertainty and extreme cases. And so in those environments, we have to understand that what we're not seeing are one or more of those aspects, duration, pathway, or outcome. And that's how that fits into this whole concept of the 6 steps of mastering uncertainty.
We talked last time on the podcast about peak versus optimal performance, but I guess it's a good opportunity to revisit that because not everybody will have listened or watched that podcast. So yeah, in that regard, why is the distinction so important?
Yeah, the distinction is that while everybody loves peak performance and strives to, in some cases, try to chase peak performance all the time, peak is simply an apex. And an apex, there's only one place you can go from an apex, and that's down, right? Peak performance also often has to be planned for and scheduled and prepared for. The pro football player plans and schedules his entire week so that he could peak for 3 hours on game day, okay? We don't get to do that as regular people or even Navy SEALs. We have to perform with what we've got. So optimal performance means I'm going to do the very best in the moment, whatever the best looks like in that moment. Sometimes my best looks like peak, but sometimes my best is I am literally head down going step by step because that's all I have right now. And it's dirty and it's gritty and it's ugly and it's hard. So we don't want to think about optimal performance as this umbrella underneath which peak lives and gutting it out lives and even recovery lives. So we're modulating our performance inside of that, and all of it's good because we're still performing. And it's a solid understanding or approach to performance that we should take when we're talking about uncertainty, because it's very difficult to be at peak when you're thrust into uncertainty. But that's okay. We can accept that because all we need to do is be optimal.
Moving horizons seem quite central to your approach. So how do you explain it works in practice?
Yeah, so moving horizons is in fact the tool. It's the first tool for actually stepping through uncertainty and challenge and stress. And what moving horizons is quite literally creating a duration pathway outcome by picking something to focus on. So an example would be Navy SEAL training, obviously known as some of the most difficult training in the world. 90% attrition rate, right? And you spend hundreds of hours, for example, running around with big, heavy boats on your head. Okay. And I remember doing this. It was middle of the night at some point. We had been doing it for hours. We were miserable. We were on the beach, and I remember running with this thing, and next to us was a sand berm. And I remember saying to myself, you know what? I'm just going to focus on getting to the end of the sand berm. All right. And what I did without knowing it is I picked a horizon and in essence created a DPO. I created a duration pathway outcome. So I created a duration, which was from now until I get to the end of the sand berm, a pathway from here to end of sand berm, and an outcome, end of sand berm. As soon as I did that, I cemented certainty into my framework and created a goal, because once I got to the end of that sand berm, I got a dopamine reward, because when we do that, we get dopamine, okay? Which allowed me then pull back out and ask the question again, what do I focus on now? What horizon should I pick? And so moving horizons is simply the neurological equivalent of eating the elephant one bite at a time. We're picking things to focus on, picking different chunks and moving to those. We're creating different DPOs. Now, what's interesting about this, what we have to understand is this process is highly subjective to both the individual and the environment in terms of intensity. So in other words, the more intense environment, the shorter the horizon, oftentimes. So for example, there were times during SEAL training where I'd be like, okay, I'm just going to make it to the end of the day. That's my goal. Okay. That's a pretty meaty chunk. Okay. But that was fine in the moment. There were other times where I was freezing in the surf zone and I was just saying to myself, I'm just going to count 5 waves. Okay. There might be times where a human being is in such intensity that they say, I'm just going to take 10 breaths or 5 breaths, right? So this horizon picking and this moving horizons process has to be subjective, and the horizons have to be meaningful. In other words, our dopamine response works very interestingly in the sense that if you pick a horizon that's too far out, you will run out of dopamine. You won't be able to get there. You'll run out of dopamine on the way and you will quit or give up on the way. If you pick a horizon that's too short, you're not going to get the reward when you hit it. So all of our horizons need to be just outside that comfort zone level. So it's attainable, but it takes a little effort to get there. And that's where we start to hit the sweet spot of these horizons. That's why the horizon needs to shift depending on your specific environments. If you and I were to run a marathon together, I certainly haven't ever run a marathon, but we may be running that marathon together, and I might be looking at every mile marker as my horizons. You might be looking at every 5 miles as your horizons, but it's all subjective to the individual.
When I run distances, 17 miles is generally when I start to switch on and I have to concentrate. And yeah, that wall.
The wall. And when that wall hit, you have to shift your horizons, right? Your horizons become shorter. Whereas you may have cruised to mile 17. You're like, okay, this is cool. Once that wall hits, now you might be like, okay, now I'm just going to go mile by mile.
An interesting part, because it leads us into the part I want to talk about, which is the 6 steps. And in that regard, especially around dopamine and motivation, you talk about meaningful horizons. So we've just given an analogy there of running, but in the challenges that you faced, is there a specific example where outside of the training that a meaningful horizon played a key part in your outlook?
Yeah, to be as direct as possible, sometimes the horizon is survive this next 5 minutes. All right. If you're in a situation where things are just very complex and dangerous, your horizon might be like, oh, I got to run from here to that next wall or whatever. I use a less extreme example, but still extreme enough for, I think, what you're looking for. One of the operations or one of the methods that we use, this is called a HAHO, high altitude, high opening parachute operations. This is where you jump out of an airplane at about 22,000 feet and you pull your chute, you count to 4 and pull your chute. And so you open up around 20,000 feet and you fly miles and miles to a drop zone, usually an unknown one that you haven't seen before, land. And then from there, you patrol to wherever the target is. Okay. Very complex maneuver, complex stuff's going on there. And of course, then you have to worry about getting the target. And then at the target, you have to worry about executing the target, right? Doing the job. And then of course, you have to worry about getting off and getting away from the target. So there's a whole intricate tapestry of things that have to go on to plan and get and prepare for an operation of this scope. I remember talking to a couple of my buddies who we did this, we served together. And one of my buddies said, you know what though, when I'm in that airplane at 20,000 feet and that ramp opens up, okay, there's only one thing I'm thinking. And this is with everything. We have this whole thing in front of us. There's only one thing I'm thinking. I said, what are you thinking? He's nail the exit. Because if you don't jump out of the airplane in a stable position, your chute's not going to open properly. Now you're effed, right? First thing is, and we're all like, exactly. You're not worried about anything else but nailing the exit. As soon as you nail the exit, now pull my parachute. Okay. As soon as the parachute, now get on heading. So even in these extreme, huge, where you have tons of dangerous stuff in front of you, we were still chunking the environment into what do I know and what can I control in this moment. I'm not going to worry about anything that I can't control right now because that's a waste of energy. I want to control and worry about what I can control this moment and then shift and move that way. So that's a more of extreme case that most people probably wouldn't experience.
So in reference to the control element and also the 6 steps themselves, maybe to somebody that hasn't had the fortune of reading the book yet, what are the 6 steps specifically?
Yeah. So first step is moving the horizon. That's number one. The next step is keep going. And what that is literally just the idea of setting meaningful horizons, using that dopamine to your advantage. So you're setting meaningful horizons. So you move your horizons, keep going by setting meaningful horizons. Staying cool is the third step. Staying cool simply means that when we are in these moments of uncertainty, and with uncertainty often comes stress and anxiety and fear, what's happening is our autonomic arousal is going up. Okay. As our autonomic arousal goes up, our frontal lobe, our decision-making brain, begins to start to take a back seat to our limbic brain, our emotional brain, right? In the extreme cases, this is called autonomic overload or amygdala hijack. Okay. This is when you are completely hijacked. Your frontal lobe has gone completely back and you are now acting without thinking. Okay. It comes in very handy when you're jumping out of the way of a moving train. You don't want to have to think about that, or pulling your hand off a hot stove, whatever that is. Doesn't come in very handy when you're trying to make conscious, good decisions and stepping through uncertainty. So what stay cool means is there are tools that allow us to regulate our autonomic arousal and bring our autonomic arousal down, bring that frontal lobe back online. So we're actually making conscious decisions. Now you can do that in visual. There are visual tools that I outline in the book. There are certain things you can do visually. There are breathing techniques you can use to manage your autonomic arousal, either up or down, but allow you to understand where you need to be, that sweet spot of being able to actually, in fact, make decisions. And that's all kind of the physiological aspect. So that's the first 3 steps physiologically. Then the second 3 steps bring into the fold those things we need to understand about ourselves. In other words, what are those things about ourselves that define our behavior and performance in uncertainty? Okay. How do we act at our most raw? And why do we act at our most raw? Or why do we do that? And so the first one is our attributes. Attributes, if we break this down into how, why, and what, right? In other words, how we do what we do, why we do what we do, and then what we do. The how piece, how we do what we do, is the attributes. Our unique set of attributes start to describe how we're going to behave in uncertainty, challenge, and stress. So in other words, and you're very familiar with the attributes concept, and you know that when you look at the 41 attributes, you have a number 1 attribute all the way down to your number 41 attribute. So you're really high on one and you're low on another. If I know I'm high in adaptability but low on resilience, that's going to affect my performance when I'm in uncertainty, challenge, and stress. If I know I'm high on decisiveness but low on patience, that's also going to affect my performance. So understanding where we fall attribute-wise is very important. The next one is identity, because identity is something that we often don't consider. And what we have to think about in terms of identity is that we have, first of all, the 2 most powerful words in the human language are the words I am, because whatever we put after those 2 words is what shapes our behavior and what shapes our focus. What we have to recognize is as we go through life, we actually collect a series of I ams, and they could be very powerful all the way to somewhat benign. It could be, I went to this high school. I'm a this high school graduate. I'm a lacrosse player. I'm a Navy SEAL. I'm a husband. I'm a father. I'm a motorcycle enthusiast. I'm a Metallica fan. Okay. Whatever those are, every one of the I ams or identities we collect comes with it some rules and behaviors and conditions and biases that define behavior inside of that identity. And we absorb those. We do without knowing it. We absorb those. And so we need to get clear on our identities, because when we are in uncertainty, challenge, and stress, we will typically behave towards those identities when we prioritize. So in other words, when I was in combat, my 2 most powerful identities, as you might imagine, were Navy SEAL and husband and father. Okay. When I was in combat, obviously my Navy SEAL identity was prioritized. But sometimes something would happen, for example, and I'd suddenly have to shift, and my husband-father identity was prioritized. Certainly when I'm at home, my husband-father identity is prioritized in uncertainty, challenge, or stress. But all this to say, by identifying these identities, no pun intended, we begin to understand, get a clearer picture of how and why we perform the way we do, or the what's around our performance. Then finally, there's objectives. The objectives are the whys, because objectives are really about turning what is a larger purpose into concrete goals. In other words, growing up, I wanted to be someone who helped and served my country and did so in a kind of a cool way and helped people and saved people and all that stuff. Okay. That's a fairly big purpose. All right. The concrete goal, the objective I created was become a Navy SEAL. All right. That was the objective. And so these objectives that we create are, of course, driving us in these challenges, in these moments. And certainly in SEAL training, that was an objective that was driving me. The key thing we have to remember about objectives, however, is oftentimes those objectives are pretty large. All right. So what we can't do is we can't focus on them all the time because it'd be too much. So I had this saying, I say, take your eyes off the prize. Instead of keep your eyes on the prize, take your eyes off the prize. Because we know if you're focusing on this big thing, if you're focusing on the whole elephant, it's going to be overwhelming. But you're still, again, your goal is still to eat the elephant, but you don't want to focus on that all the time. You want to actually create horizons and DPO your way through it. But that objective is still driving you. So understanding what those objectives are very important. So those are really kind of the 6 steps that allow us to understand how and why we're going to perform the way we do.
Just to return to the I am statement, in that regard, you identified it's critical to determining our actions, but especially under pressure. In maybe some examples, where have you seen the negative side?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. I think it's also a great point, is that these identities, as powerful as they can be in some circumstances, may not actually help us in other circumstances. So a great one is the Navy SEAL one. I kind of joke about this in the book. So when I was getting out of the Navy, or got out of the Navy, I was asked by a couple of people, they said, what's the biggest thing you have to get used to in terms of the civilian world? And I said, I think one of the biggest things is the way you all look at time. And I said, because in my old world, there were 3 types of time. Okay, there was military time, there was civilian time, and then there was Navy SEAL time. Okay, military time was if you're not 15 minutes early or late. Civilian time was any time between start time and 15 minutes, you're fine. And then Navy SEAL time was plus or minus 30 seconds. We used to plan our helicopters that way. Hey, we want you to be here at 02:31 plus or minus 30 seconds, because for us, being too early was just as bad as being too late. There was a precision in everything we did. Now, as a civilian, if I bring that part of my identity into a conference, for example, or a workshop where I'm putting a bunch of executives through a few hours of a morning session, to expect them to show up at that level of precision is probably not going to be helpful. So I need to let go of that piece of identity and actually be open to another piece, right? So again, it's really more about understanding these rules and which rules we're bringing to an environment and if they're applicable or appropriate to how we can best perform.
From a team perspective, I remember the last time we spoke, you talked about like a leader doesn't have to lead from the front, they lead from the position that they're required to be at a particular point in time. So how can leaders begin to implement that approach that you utilize within the SEALs?
Yeah, and I would say that the problem is people think that these leadership or these hierarchical structures they see indicate leadership. They actually don't. They indicate who's in charge. And being in charge and being a leader are 2 separate things. Okay, being in charge is a position, and being a leader is a behavior. And the bad news is we don't get to self-designate. We don't get to call ourselves leaders. That's like calling yourself good-looking or funny. Okay, other people decide whether or not you are someone they want to follow based on the way you behave. I had this experience at least a couple of times in the military. I'd look at someone in a hierarchical position above me and be like, I wouldn't follow that person anywhere. Meanwhile, there's someone over here to my left who has no hierarchical position whatsoever. I'd be like, I would follow that person to hell and back. Okay, so I think what we have to understand in teaming, if we are in a position of being in charge and we have a desire to be a leader, we have to understand that leadership and the desire for others to follow us is going to be based on how we behave. Those behaviors stem from very elemental things, attributes, especially accountability, decisiveness, in some cases, authenticity, empathy in other cases. Okay. So that's one. And the other thing we have to understand is that the leadership model in high performing teams doesn't look anything like the leadership models we're used to. It's not the pyramid. It's not the flat line. It's not the upside down pyramid. It's in fact a blob, and it's what we call dynamic subordination. Dynamic subordination implies that a team understands that challenges and issues can come from any angle at any moment. And when one does, the person who's closest to that problem, the most capable, immediately steps up and takes lead. And everybody follows. Okay? And then the environment shifts and someone else steps up and everybody follows. It's dynamic swap between leader and follower relationship. And I also call it alpha hopping. And that alpha position just hops to where it needs to be. So we have to understand that mastering uncertainty as teams require a dynamic subordination task organization model, because to address uncertainty appropriately, you can't have any one person saying, hey, follow me on everything. You have to have an organism that reacts and responds appropriately to wherever the problems and issues and challenges are coming from.
Throughout your career and journey thus far, that within the SEALs and since you've subsequently left, who inspires you as a leader and why?
That's a great question. I think I can think a few different people I worked for in the military that inspired me. It'd be hard for me to think of probably a well-known person, although I won't gaff off the question. I'll continue to think about it. But I'll just say in those who inspired me, at least in the military, were those who first of all, they created a dynamically subordinating environment. That was their overall mission. I want to create an environment where all of the people in my span of care are empowered to step up and step back and support each other. So that was number one. They built trust. And by building trust, they behaved in ways that allowed for trust to be built. Okay. So they went first in those behaviors, and they were humble and they were vulnerable, and they indicated to us as those in their span of care that we were people they needed. They couldn't do it themselves. They saw the team as an organism versus just a hierarchical structure or an I say you do environment. So I think that those that have really inspired me are the ones who behaved that way. They brought the best out of their team. They allowed for the team to take risks and make mistakes, and they delegated responsibility but not accountability. That's a sign of a true leader. And all those things combined are the ones when I think of those folks, that's why I think of them to this day as leaders. Because again, honestly, if you do your job and you are in fact seen as a leader by a human being or a group of human beings, that doesn't go away. You can stop being in charge and they will still consider you a leader. Years and years later, they will. I still have people come who I keep in touch with. Like, Rich, I loved working with you as a leader. I just loved it. And that's very humbling and I'm honored to hear that. And it just tells me that at that time, at least, I was doing the right thing. There were other times I didn't do the right thing, by the way. I was not always the best. Sometimes I was the guy in charge. I had to learn this stuff, but you create people who are endeared to you for life. Yeah.
But trust as well. Trust is a foundation to your work. So I guess this gives us a good opportunity to dive into the 4 domains of trust.
Yeah. So the domains of trust they come with these behaviors. So I'll just go through them. So the first domain is competence. Competence is very easily defined as do the thing right. Okay. The second domain is consistency, and that's defined as do the thing right over time. Now, what's interesting about those first 2 elements is oftentimes we tend to focus on these elements more than the other 2 because they can be, I will concede, skills-based and highly visible. Okay. This is why businesses and teams often focus or over-index on competency and consistency. But if we miss the other 2, we're missing 2 very important factors. We're missing the next one, which is character, right? Character, a pretty big word. If I were to break it down, I'd say integrity. So you have to do the thing right in competence. You have to do the thing right over time in consistency. You have to do the right thing when it comes to character and integrity. Then finally, you have compassion. Do the right thing for me because you care about me as a human being. And so what we have to understand is in building an environment of trust, you can actually begin to build an environment of trust inside of any one of these 4 factors. But it's only when you have all 4 that you have all the longest lasting, most durable trust. And so what we as leaders need to do is ensure that we're behaving in ways that build out all 4 of these factors, so that you actually have all 4 rather than just consistency, just competence. And that's how you really build that very foundational element of teaming.
When I was reading the book, I was drawn to a specific story. It was the San Clemente Island story. Yeah, I'd love to dive into that story a little bit more.
Yeah, of course. Just to give context to the audience, so SEAL training, which is called BUDS, Basic Underwater Demolition / SEAL Training, this is where regular sailors go to become Navy SEALs, right? It's a 6-month long course. Again, like I said, there's a 90% attrition rate. It's 3 phases. So first phase is, I would say, kick your ass phase. It's basically just seeing who quits. It's the hardest stuff in terms of you have Hell Week and all that stuff. So almost you get all your quitters in first phase. Now, SEALs training still stays hard because then second phase is all the diving stuff. So you start learning diving and all that stuff. And then the third phase is land warfare. So you're learning weapons and demolition and things like that. The last 5 weeks of third phase that you spend on an island off the coast of San Diego called San Clemente Island. It's a small island. I think it's only 10 miles long, a mile wide at its widest point. And the military owns this island. The SEALs go out there to do all their noisy stuff, like blow things up and shoot. And the SEAL trainees go out there to learn all that stuff. And so one of the sayings as a student going out there is when you're on the island, no one can hear you scream, okay? Because they're still doing crazy stuff. So they make you earn the right to eat every meal, crazy exercises just to earn the right to eat. One was called a hill run. And it was where you had to basically stand at the base of a hill and you had to sprint up like a 200-meter sprint or so, and then touch this concrete monument and then come back down. The hill was just long, tall, and steep. But the time with which you had to do that decreased every week. Now, when you did it, you had none of your gear on. You were just sprinting in your camouflage, okay? The reason why I say that is because they also used the hill for punishments. The punishment version of the hill run was called a flight, okay? The flight is Now you put all of your kit, your gear on. So now you have your water canteens and your ammunition. That's about 45 pounds or so. Then they make you grab a moving pallet. We all know the moving pallets that forklifts use. Forklifts move around. Okay. There's the wooden pallets, which are 35, 40 pounds. And then there's the metal pallets. There's metal versions, just 75, 8 pounds. Obviously, we had only the best for SEAL students. We had the metal pallets, right? So you grab a metal pallet, you put it on your back, and you stand at that line, and you say permission to take off, and the instructor says permission granted, and then you have to run up the hill. Okay, now you're no longer running because you have 120 pounds of stuff. Okay, you're really grunting up the hill. That's called a flight. Okay, now I had to give all that exposition to make sure I set up the story. The story goes, okay, it's my class. We're on the island. It's the last day of training, where it's the next day we're flying off flying off the island to go graduate SEAL training. So we're all done. We're ecstatic because we started with 178 people. Now we're down to 38 of us left. Okay. And at one point we hear an instructor say, "Hey, class 210 muster on the flight line." And so we're all groaning and moaning and what the hell's going on? So we all walk out there, and the instructor gets up on the podium and he says, "Okay, what's the fastest hill run anybody's ever done?" And I don't even remember. I'm going to say 2 minutes or something. Said, "Okay, all of you are going to do flights until someone beats that time." So now, just to remind people, hill run is sprinting up the hill, just camouflage. Flight is you're trudging up the hill with all this stuff. So I'm not sure what noise or sound I made that cued Goodman into me, but I made some sort of noise, and Goodman looks at me and says, "Hey, you have a problem with this?" And so I said, "Yeah, I have a problem with that." I stepped out of line. I said, "Yeah, I have a problem with this." He said, "What's your problem?" I said, "This is a stupid idea. It's dumb. Guys are going to get hurt doing this. It's our last day. We shouldn't even be out here." Now, as soon as I said that, the guys around me were all dead quiet. The words leave my mouth. I'm like, "Oh my God, what did I just do?" Goodman is silent for what seems like forever, and finally says, "Okay, since Diviney has a problem with this, what we're going to do instead is we're all going to run back to the barracks. We're going to go to the auditorium, and we're going to watch movies for the rest of the afternoon." All right. Now, all of us are stunned until someone starts running before he changes his mind. So we all start running. And it's cool. High fives, everything feels great. But I don't tell the story for that reason. I tell the story because of what happened 17 years later. 17 years later, I run into two guys from my BUDS class. I hadn't seen them in 17 years. I was basically an East Coast SEAL. They were West Coast SEALs. So it was great to reminisce and visit. And at one point, one of the guys says, "Hey, sir, do you remember that time you stood up to Goodman on the flight line?" And of course, I hadn't thought about it in a while. I said, "Sure, I remember." And both of them at that moment said, "Sir, we would trust you anytime, anywhere. We would follow you anytime, anywhere." And so this is what occurred to me when we began to put together these four domains, these four elements of trust. And that 17 years later, obviously there was still competence and consistency. We were all Navy SEALs, although they had no clue what kind of SEAL I was. I could have been horrible. I wasn't. I was fine, just so you know. But they had no clue. Why that memory, why that trust endured is because the other two had been present. 17 years later, I had stepped out of line. I had done the right thing because I cared about my teammates. Okay. That's what forged all four of those. And so the idea is it explains this idea that if we take the time to work on all four elements, we create a very long lasting, durable trust. And that's how important it is.
Framed around the current landscape, both organizational and geopolitical, bear in mind the tensions that has taken place throughout the world at this point in time, and also the challenges within an industry I know quite well. For example, the games industry, there's awful lot of layoffs there. There's a lot of turbulence within the marketplace. So from your perspective, what are the biggest mistakes we're seeing organizations and quote unquote leaders making today?
Gosh, that could open up a real can of worms, right? Again, first of all, all of us have to understand that leadership is a choice. And I'm not saying it's a choice by the leader, it's a choice by the follower. So in the case where these leaders have been put into position by people, we have to recognize and ask ourselves, okay, what are those aspects? What are those behaviors that allowed for this leader to be seen as a leader? And I think all of us can agree, regardless of what side of the politics you're on, is that some of us are completely baffled when we see certain leaders, like, how the heck can you look at that person as a leader? But what we have to say is, wait a second, it has nothing to do with how we see that person. It has to do with how the other person sees. So I think first thing we have to do as humans in this environment is look at some of these leaders and ask ourselves and be honest with ourselves about the fact that these leaders were placed into positions, in most cases, not all, but in most cases, because a bunch of other people saw them as leaders. Okay. That's how we build empathy. We started asking ourselves, okay, let me put myself in the shoes of these people and ask myself how and why might they feel that way? Okay. So that's what we have to recognize as people. As leaders, we have to recognize that people have put us in those positions because of behaviors, right? So we have to continue behaving, but also I think recognize, certainly in the case of politics, okay, where you have elected officials, and oftentimes elected officials, you have maybe 50% of the vote, or sometimes less. When you are someone who's put into a position where you are in charge of the entire whole, yet only 50% of that population has actually put you there, the other 50% did not want you there. It is still your responsibility to lead those people. Okay. And so I think a mistake that I see made constantly and have seen continue to be made is a lack of empathy for those people who didn't vote for you or put you in that position. Okay. And now in the business world, it's even more so because in a business world, you're often hired into a position of leadership, which means no one in that organization chose you to be there, right? You were just put there. So now you have to do even more to behave in a way that allows for those folks to really look at you and say, okay, this is someone who I can trust, who I will follow. So again, it really comes down to behaving in a way that allows folks to look at you as a leader. That's what's the most important thing. And the mistake I think most leaders make is they don't look at leadership as a behavior. They look at leadership as a position. And if you look at it as a position, yeah, you're going to be in charge and you can dictate, you can park out orders, but no one's going to look at you as someone they'd want to follow. And that could be a problem down the road.
When we had that first conversation, we talked about the attributes and the 41 and the fall within that. The subsequent question I would like to ask is in regards to biggest mistakes organizations themselves are making when trying to build high performing teams.
Well, one of the biggest mistakes is they're over-indexing on skills. Okay. When it comes to the skills attribute matrix, if you're going to put together a team based on just skills, you're missing out on those elemental qualities that allow for teaming to happen. Teaming happens because of the integration of parts, right? In other words, a team, just like a system, is never just the sum of its parts. It's a product of how they interact. You can have the best people, the people who do the best at the thing, right? And if they don't interact together, they are going to be a toxic team. And so those interactions often stem from these attributes, these qualities that are often unseen. And so I think teaming, the mistake I see in most teams make, and certainly the work we do with the attributes incorporated, is we go into business and teams and help them understand what attributes they're bringing to the table, both as individuals and as teammates. It allows for a much deeper understanding and empathy to, oh, wait a second, now I can look at this person who seemed so different from me before, and probably is from an attributes perspective, but now I look at that person as an asset versus a liability. For example, a lot of people feel frustration in someone else because they have a lot of one attribute, the other person has a little bit of that attribute. So patience is a great example. The person who's impatient will often look at the patient person and be like, that person is slow and never makes decisions. It's just frustrating. Same thing with the patient person looking at the impatient person. But once you see it from an attribute perspective, judgment goes away and you start seeing the advantages of both polarities on a team, and how, like my wife and I'm patient and she's impatient. That's worked beautifully for us, right? Because when patience is required, I step up in the dynamic subordination environment. When impatience is required, she steps up. My patience has sometimes prevented her from making too quick a decision or moving too rapidly. Her impatience has sometimes prevented me from going too slow or procrastinating on something. So I think what teams need to understand is if you start to understand these elemental attributes, you start to get a real full understanding of everybody and each other's behavior, and judgment goes away. And as soon as judgment goes away, the team accelerates. Judgment is like a glue that starts to really slow a team's ability to move fast. As soon as you remove that, you start to really accelerate in a very high-performing way.
And under the lens of high-performing teams, outside of the lens of attributes, what other quick wins would you recommend?
Certainly build trust. Start by building those four elements of trust. That's where it has to all start. Yeah, you start there. The other thing is be candid with each other, and candid in a way that we know that it's not, I'm just going to be the a-hole telling you what you're wrong, what you're doing wrong. I'm actually going to give you feedback. Even though it's hard to hear, it's because I want you to become better. All right. It also builds trust, by the way. The best teams do this constantly, all the time with each other. It doesn't even matter. It's always happening. We're always giving feedback to each other. And hey, by the way, this is what got screwed up. This is what you need to learn. This is how you improve it. Okay, cool. Check. Now, you do that enough, you create that habit within a team. You often don't ever have to tell people they screwed up. They will be the first to step up in front of the group and say, hey, by the way, I screwed that up. Here's what I did wrong. Here's what I need to do to improve. It happens, and then it can happen very quickly. So candor with care is another one. And really, the last one is, I say, or I guess really important one, is to understand that we have to honor our antagonists. I talk about honoring those low points, those things that happen to us as individuals or as teams. Those are opportunities for growth and opportunities for learning. And so every high performing team seizes upon those to learn and grow. They don't seize upon them to point fingers and blame and create toxicity. They seize upon them to actually learn and grow. And part of that is that feedback loop. So I think those are real important things, aspects of teaming and really creating those high performing teams everybody's desiring to do.
Yeah, I'm a big advocate of challenge and change and the learnings from that. I think we spoke about it last time about the whole Ray Dalio quote of pain plus reflection equals progress. And also a buddy of yours, Andrew Huberman, I remember watching him on Rich Roll's podcast when he was talking about the interjection. And yeah, I'm a big advocate of the interjection from an empathy piece. I love the friend of yours, Simon Sinek, and watching some of the stuff that he does on the basis of how he approaches the lens of leadership and his viewpoint. And it is very much from an empathetic stance. And for me, anyways, looking at the world today, the strongest leaders to me and the ones that I would follow are the ones that have lived and breathed challenge and change and got the scars to show for it. And I think that's probably why some of your colleagues, when they see you years after in random opportunities to say thank you, that's a credit to yourself too.
Yeah, it's certainly the best part of leadership, I would say. So.
From a personal perspective, how do people apply some of the lessons within your book specifically to their own individual circumstances rather than through the lens of teams, but individually?
Yeah, and the idea is to start noticing those times of uncertainty. It's not going to be hard because they're all around us. And in doing so, start to implement some of these tools. Again, one of the greatest advantages I see of articulating this stuff is that once you articulate it, it can be repeated. And once it can be repeated, it can be practiced. And then so you can take any environment, even one that might be somewhat rote or feel rote, like I got to create a PowerPoint presentation today for something tomorrow, right? Start using the horizon shifting and creating some DPOs around that and practice this stuff, because the more you practice it, the better you get at it. And if you get really good at it, if you become a true master, you do it without thinking. This is why I call the SEALs masters of uncertainty. We do this without thinking about it. Every single time something happens that is uncertain or something comes into our purview that we are thrust into uncertainty, we automatically start doing this without thinking. And the reason why that is because we got it hyper developed in SEAL training and then we hyper developed it in our professions. I wrote the book in a way that allows people to read about it and then gives them some tools and techniques that they can practice things to think about and take this stuff and practice it and just do it over and over. Use those little events of uncertainty and challenge to exercise the muscles so that when the big stuff happens, you're into it.
What practices from the book have had the most profound impact on your own life and why?
I would probably say the moving horizon practice. And I say that because I recognize that I've been moving horizons since I was a kid. And I think that I showed up to the beaches of Bud's training already knowing how to do this. And that's why I made it through, because I already had an aptitude in this process. And of course, once you're in there, you're hyper developing it. But I think the guys who show up to the beaches of Bud's and they have not had enough practice in this, they're not good enough at it, they're the ones who quit. And so I think that's the biggest one, because that shaped my entire life in terms of my profession, in terms of how I approach everything and how I approached everything and in a way that allowed me to be successful. Yeah, probably the moving horizons. That's why I was thrilled to be able to articulate it, because I was like, okay, cool, this is it. And that's very powerful.
You mentioned time a little earlier, especially like time from a SEAL's perspective, like within 30 seconds. How have you found the transition from SEAL to civilian?
I've actually found it to be quite fun, quite nice. Certainly you get a sense of loss because you're going to work every day and hanging out with that level caliber person is certainly a phenomenal thing to do. However, I'm a big believer in stepping outside your comfort zone for growth. And so part of transition for me was the fact that I was stepping outside my comfort zone. I was moving from something I've been doing for 21 years into the unknown. And so that excites me to a certain degree. The other thing I looked at it was building a whole new identity. I had to put that Navy SEAL identity aside and put it on the shelf because I'm no longer a Navy SEAL. I'm a former Navy SEAL, but I'm not a Navy SEAL anymore. And so by putting that on the shelf, I opened the door to create a new identity. Author, it's entrepreneur, whatever those are, but that's allowed me a new challenge to focus on. So anybody who's in transition, I want to give them the assurance that they can actually get the same juice and the same kind of excitement, the same high from transitioning as they got in the military, because they're going to have to utilize the same tools. It's just going to feel uncomfortable again. And that's a really odd thing to be doing, especially someone who spends a career, 20 plus years in a career or even more. There's not many people you hear in the civilian world who do something for 20 or 30 years and then completely shift and do something completely brand new. It doesn't happen as often. And so this is a very unique experience and opportunity for anybody in transition. And I would say capitalize on it and use it. Listen, if we're not growing, I think we're dying. So grow. I don't care how old I am. I'm always going to be looking for new opportunities to grow.
Coming to an end now, but just to close out a few questions. If you were to give listeners or viewers an opportunity to implement one thing from Masters of Uncertainty, what would you recommend that be? And secondly, what would your key thought and takeaway be for our audience today?
Yeah, I think if there's one thing, it's to move the horizons. Just start practicing this technique. That's the one thing. There's obviously a bunch of things in the book that you can dive into and look in, and which will help you with that endeavor. But if there's just one thing, it's that key concept.
What's the most surprising bit of feedback that you've received from people outside of those within a military context?
I'm going to answer this in two ways. Okay. The first way, and they're both honest answers. The first one is the fact that people read the whole thing. Because again, and I get it. I love reading, but reading a book, a full book, is a difficult task. A lot of us don't have time, especially in nonfiction. Fiction is easy because you get caught up in it. So you want to see how it ends. But nonfiction books are often difficult to read to the end. So the fact that I'm getting a lot of feedback, hey, I read this whole thing in one or two sittings, that's been surprising to me. But also my intent. That's why I wrote the book much shorter than my first book. But the other thing also is how applicable it is across the spectrum of people. Okay, my mother-in-law, who's in her late 70s, read the book, and she wrote me a letter because she felt a phone call was too quick. And she wrote me a letter explaining to me how much and how meaningful the concepts in the book were to her in her life. Meanwhile, we have a niece who's in nursing school, and she's in her early 20s. And she says she reached out and said how much the concepts have helped her and her nursing friends too. So the scope of applicability for me has been surprising and really fun because but it's also quite comforting because I know this stuff that we're talking about is human stuff. It has nothing to do with generation or age or religion or country or whatever that is. It is human. And that's what's exciting. It's a book for humans, which I like.
And it's a book for growth. It hit a lot of the numbers on what motivates me because back to what I said before, if you're not growing, you're dying. And that, I believe that we've got to push ourselves to see what we're capable of. But yeah, man, it's been an absolute pleasure as always. And yeah, I wish you all the success with the book. I guess two last things. Firstly, how can people get in contact with you should they want to reach out, especially bearing in mind the attribute assessment that we went through last time? That was fantastic. And I strongly encourage people to do the same. But yeah, secondly is the key thought and takeaway. What would you like to leave with our audience?
Yeah, absolutely. So best way is theattributes.com. That's our website. And there you can find everything. You can find links to buy the books, both books, all of our workshops. You can actually there's a link to the assessment tool as well. So theattributes.com is a one-stop shop. I'm obviously on Instagram and LinkedIn. You can look me up there. And then of course the books are on Amazon or Amplify.com. So yeah, I would say check it all out. Follow on Instagram and LinkedIn and let us know if we can help. But hopefully it'll inspire and help you. I'd say the key takeaway is that, and I have this quote in the beginning of the book, and it's from Eric Fromm, and says, uncertainty is the realm from which man impels his power. And I love the quote because it talks about the fact that we as human beings grow from uncertainty and challenge and stress. We don't grow by sitting and doing things we know and that are fun and that are comfortable. And so it's really the key takeaway is this is a call to action to not only learn how to do better when uncertainty hits, but also get yourself to a position where you go seek it out and you deliberately step outside of your comfort zone. You deliberately grow and expand and explore and discover. That's the key takeaway, I think. So that's why I encourage everybody to do.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, brother. Great to be back. Thank you.